Shropshire, 1945. The English countryside stretched green and impossibly peaceful under skies finally clear of bombers, hedgerows dividing fields that had fed Britain through 6 years of war. In a village hall outside Oswestry, Eleanor Crawford reviewed transport arrangements by candlelight, her schoolteacher's hands trembling as she read German names that still seemed impossible to associate with women. 8 miles south, behind wire fencing and concrete guard posts, 28 German women stood at morning assembly at Camp 23, their grey uniforms bearing the marks of North African hospitals and Italian aid stations. They had been told Britain was starving and devastated by war. They would soon walk through village streets that contradicted everything they knew about their enemies' suffering. The war had scattered strange cargo across Britain's gentle landscapes, prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. But these were not the expected prisoners. Not the Wehrmacht soldiers filling camps in Scotland, not the Luftwaffe crews in Yorkshire. These were women, nurses mostly, some signals operators. Young women conscripted into the Nachrichtenhelferin and Medical Corps, captured when Allied forces swept through North Africa and Italy. When the campaigns ended in chaos and surrender, none of them had imagined Shropshire. Camp 23 occupied farmland that had been requisitioned in 1943. Its boundaries marked by wire that seemed almost apologetic against the pastoral landscape, its buildings constructed from local stone. The women had arrived on a Friday afternoon in February, stepping from military lorries into cold that felt nothing like the desert heat they had left behind. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, watched them file past, noting their exhaustion, their wariness, the way they moved with military bearing despite obvious fear. The prisoners ranged in age from 19 to 44. Most had been nurses at field hospitals in Tunisia and Sicily. A few had served with communications units. Some had been teachers and secretaries before conscription. All had been processed through holding facilities in Italy before the Channel crossing. Then, trains through southern England to this place where the land rolled gentle as a lullaby and church bells still rang on Sundays. They had expected devastation. Instead, they found something they could not comprehend. The camp commandant, Major Helen Thornbury, had served as a nurse in the Great War. She remembered field hospitals in France, remembered German wounded who had been boys like the British boys, suffering without ideology. These women were different, professionals in their way. She saw in their faces the same exhaustion, the same disbelief at survival, mixed with uncertainty about what came next. "Your status is protected by international law," she told them through an interpreter, a German-speaking corporal named Davies. "You will work in the local community. The labour is necessary, but the treatment is lawful. Any mistreatment will be reported. Any escape attempt will result in consequences." The women stood silent in the assembly hall. Through the windows, they could see countryside that looked untouched by war, green and ordered and impossibly normal. Nothing like the chaos of retreat or the devastated fatherland they had left behind. This was a landscape that spoke of continuity, of something that had endured while their world burned. That night in the barracks, they whispered in German while guards walked the perimeter outside. "How is this possible?" someone asked. "Their cities should be rubble like ours." Margaret Fisher, a former nurse who had worked field hospitals in Bizerte, stared at the ceiling. "Perhaps," she said quietly. "We were not told everything about this war." Eleanor Crawford was 38 years old and teaching in a village school that her grandmother had attended. 30 students, ages 5 to 14, learning in a building that had stood since 1780. Her husband was missing in Burma, status unknown. Her brother had died at Arnhem. Her sister drove ambulances in London. She managed the school with whatever help she could find, but the war had taken the young teachers. The work remained. When the Women's Voluntary Service representative arrived to discuss prisoner labour, Eleanor sat in the school staff room and listened to the proposal. German women POWs, the official explained. Nurses and educated women who need work assignments. You need help with the children and the community services. The government supervises the arrangement. You provide basic direction, report any concerns. Eleanor looked at the village around her, at gardens overgrown and children needing supervision while mothers worked in factories. She thought about propaganda she had heard about Germans, about the Blitz and the bombing. She thought about her brother, buried in Holland. "How many?" she asked. "6, the official said. "They will work in the school and community 4 days weekly. You provide supervision, basic courtesy, report any issues immediately." Eleanor nodded slowly. The children would not wait for her to resolve her feelings about enemies. "Send them Monday," she said. They arrived on foot on a Monday, when spring was just beginning to touch the hedgerows and morning light made the village look like a watercolour. 6 women in grey uniforms walked down the main street, escorted by Lieutenant Mitchell, their faces carefully neutral, their posture military despite visible apprehension. Eleanor watched from the school steps, the headmistress, Mrs. Alice Pemberton, standing beside her. "They look terrified," Alice said quietly. "They should be," Eleanor replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Lieutenant Mitchell approached with paperwork. "These are your workers, Miss Crawford. Several speak excellent English. The one called Margaret speaks it fluently. They understand expectations. I return at 4 o'clock. Eleanor nodded. She descended the steps and stopped 10 feet from the women. They stood in formation, hands at their sides, eyes scanning the village with barely concealed shock. She could see confusion on their faces, something like disbelief. "You will help with the school and community services," Eleanor said clearly. "The work is necessary. You will have tea breaks and lunch. You follow my instructions and treat the children with care. Questions?" Margaret stepped forward slightly. Her English carried an accent, but was precise. "We understand, Miss Crawford. We will work." Eleanor studied her face. She was perhaps 28, with blonde hair pinned back severely, eyes that had seen things Eleanor preferred not to imagine. There was no defiance in her expression, but no civility either. Just a kind of exhausted professionalism. "Very well," she said. "Follow me to the school." They walked through the village, 6 women and 2 escorts, their figures drawing stares from villagers going about morning routines. Eleanor watched the German women's faces as they took in the scene. Shops open, children playing, gardens tended, life continuing. She saw something like shock in their expressions. The first days were silent labour. The women worked with methodical efficiency, helping younger children with lessons, organising supplies, cleaning classrooms. They did not complain. They did not speak unless spoken to. When Eleanor brought tea at mid-morning, they drank quickly, but did not meet anyone's eyes. Alice reported they were capable workers, better than anticipated. "They know how to teach," she told Eleanor, "the nurses especially. They handle the children with trained gentleness." By Wednesday, Eleanor noticed Margaret watching the village through the school windows, not with surveillance or planning, but with something like wonder. That evening, she asked Lieutenant Mitchell about it. The officer shrugged. "They have been in war zones and camps for 2 years," she said. "First in combat areas, then in holding facilities, then processing centres. They have not seen normal civilian life since before the war. Your village probably looks impossible to them." Thursday morning was the day Eleanor's understanding shifted. She was in the classroom when she heard crying outside. One of the younger children, a girl named Emma, who was 5 years old, had fallen and scraped her knee badly. The child was screaming, blood running down her leg. Margaret rushed over before Eleanor could react. She knelt beside Emma, speaking softly in accented English, examining the wound with practiced hands. Eleanor and Alice ran from the building. "Not serious," Margaret said when they arrived, "but it needs cleaning and bandaging. Do you have a first aid kit?" "In the office," Eleanor said. "I'll get it." "I can treat it here," Margaret said. "If you permit, she should not walk on it immediately." Eleanor nodded. She watched as Margaret cleaned the wound with gentle efficiency, speaking quietly to Emma in simple English, distracting the child from the pain. She bandaged the knee with practiced precision, checked Emma's mobility, kept the girl calm throughout. "She will be fine," Margaret said. "Keep it clean and dry. Change the bandage tomorrow." Eleanor looked at this enemy nurse, who had just treated a British child with the same care she would have given a German patient. "Thank you," she said quietly. Margaret met her eyes directly for the first time. "Children are children," she said simply. "Nationality does not change this." That evening, sitting in her cottage after the women had been escorted back to camp, Eleanor thought about Margaret's competence, about how she had moved with the trained instincts of someone who had saved lives before. The propaganda had not prepared her for this, for professional compassion, for the absence of hatred. Friday arrived with village preparations for the weekend market. By mid-morning, the main street was busy with activity. Eleanor needed supplies from the village shops and made a decision that surprised even herself. "Margaret, Anna," she said to two of the German women, "come with me to the shops. We need materials for the school." Lieutenant Mitchell frowned. "Is that wise, Miss Crawford, taking prisoners into public spaces?" "They are supervised," Eleanor replied, "and we need the supplies." They walked down the main street, Eleanor and two German prisoners. Villagers stopped and stared. Some glared. Others simply watched with curiosity. Eleanor felt the tension radiating from Margaret and Anna, saw them taking in the scene with visible confusion. The butcher's shop had meat displayed, limited but present. The baker had bread, though rationed. The greengrocer had vegetables, grown locally and distributed fairly. Not abundance, but not starvation. Anna whispered something to Margaret in German. Margaret responded quietly, her voice carrying disbelief. "Is something wrong?" Eleanor asked. Margaret looked at her with an expression Eleanor could not quite read. "We were told Britain was starving," she said slowly, "that your cities were destroyed, that your people were dying in the streets. This." She gestured at the shops, the orderly queue, the functioning village. "This cannot be wartime Britain as we were taught." Eleanor understood then. The propaganda had painted Britain as devastated, collapsing, near defeat. And here was a village going about its business, rationed but functioning, damaged but enduring, suffering but surviving with dignity. "We are at war," Eleanor said quietly. "But we are British. We carry on." That evening, at Camp 23, Margaret wrote a letter to her sister in Dresden. The mail would go through military censors, arrive months late if it arrived at all, but she wrote anyway. "Dear Sophie," she began, "we are somewhere in England, in a place called Shropshire. We work in a village. Today I walked through streets that should not exist, shops operating, children playing, gardens growing. We were told Britain was destroyed. I thought we would find devastation. Instead, I found normal life continuing. I do not understand what we were told about this war." In her cottage, Eleanor sat at her writing desk and wrote to her husband wherever he was. "I have German prisoners helping at the school now," she wrote. "Women, nurses from Africa. They are not what I expected. Today one of them looked at our village and could not believe we were functioning. What propaganda did they believe? What lies were we both told?" These letters would cross in the mail, carried by military postal systems across oceans and continents, arriving to recipients who would read them and understand that the war was not what anyone had imagined, that it was more complicated and more human and more strange than any propaganda had prepared them for. March became April. The women came 4 days weekly, worked at the school, helped in the community, returned to camp each evening. Eleanor learnt their names, their backgrounds in fragments. Margaret was from Munich, had been a hospital nurse before conscription. Anna had been a teacher in Hamburg. Greta was older, 37, had run a kindergarten before the war. They learned English village expressions. Lovely, tar, cheerio, the rhythms of rural English that made their German accents sound almost charming. Eleanor learned some German. Bitte, danke, Entschuldigung, the language of basic courtesy. Alice, who had been doubtful at first, became their advocate. They are better with the children than some British teachers I've known, she told Eleanor, and they never lose patience, even with the difficult ones. The other villagers, elderly residents and women managing homes while men were overseas, watched the arrangement with varying degrees of acceptance. Some muttered about Germans in British villages, others saw only workers who helped overburdened services. A few, like old Mrs. Thompson, who had lost 2 sons already, refused to acknowledge them at all, but did not interfere. Eleanor's neighbour, the vicar, Reverend Thomas Hadley, stopped by one afternoon. "I hear you have German women working with the children," he said. "I have help," Eleanor replied. "That is all." "People are concerned," Thomas said. "Some worry about German influence on British children, about fraternization." "The Geneva Convention requires humane treatment and useful work," Eleanor said. "I am following the law, and the children are learning compassion." "Compassion and security are different things," Thomas said. Then he looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "But perhaps our children need to learn that enemies can be human. Perhaps that is a lesson worth teaching." In late April, Margaret approached Eleanor with a suggestion. She spoke carefully, aware she was pushing boundaries. "The school garden," she said. "It is overgrown. We could restore it. Teach the children about growing food. It would be educational and useful." Eleanor considered. It violated no regulations she knew of, might even enhance the curriculum. But it meant the German women spending more time in the village, becoming more visible, more integrated into community life. "What would you teach?" she asked. "What do German schools do differently?" "Practical horticulture," Margaret said. "Children learn by doing. We grow vegetables. They see results. They learn biology, responsibility, patience." Eleanor nodded slowly. "You can restore it," she said. "But it serves the whole school and the children's families. Whatever grows is distributed to families who need it most." Margaret's face showed surprise, then something like gratitude. "That is more than fair, Miss Crawford. That is how it should be." The garden project transformed the dynamic. The women cleared the overgrown plot with the same precision they brought to teaching, but with something else too. Something like joy, like connection to something normal. They worked with the children, teaching them to plant and tend and observe. The children forgot they were working with the enemy and simply learned from capable teachers. Margaret taught about plant biology. Anna created a watering schedule. Greta organised the children into responsible teams. Mrs. Pemberton built raised beds from donated wood. The villagers watched, some suspicious, others gradually warming to the sight of children learning regardless of who taught them. May brought an incident that tested everything. The war in Europe ended. Victory in Europe Day arrived. The village erupted in celebration, flags flying, church bells ringing, people crying with relief and joy. The German women were at the school when the news arrived. They stood frozen, uncertain what to do, watching British celebration of German defeat. Eleanor watched them watching the village celebrate. She saw Margaret's face go carefully blank, saw Anna fighting tears, saw Greta turn away to hide her expression. "Come," Eleanor said quietly to the 6 women. "Let's go to the classroom." They sat in the empty classroom while the village celebrated outside. Silence heavy between them. Finally, Margaret spoke. "My country is defeated," she said quietly. "My city may be destroyed. My sister may be dead. And I am in the enemy's village watching them celebrate." Eleanor had no words that could make this easier. What could she say? That the victory was just, that Germany deserved defeat, all true, and all inadequate in the face of their grief. "I am sorry," she said, "for your families, for your fear. War creates no winners, only survivors." Greta looked at her with red eyes. "You have a husband missing in Burma," Yes, Eleanor confirmed. Then you understand, Greta said. The not knowing, the waiting, the impossibility of celebrating when you do not know who has been lost. I understand, Eleanor said. They sat together in the classroom, a British teacher and 6 German women, all waiting for news of people they loved, all caught in a war none had chosen, all trying to find meaning in the aftermath. The celebration continued outside, but in the classroom they shared something else. A quiet recognition of shared suffering. June brought the school's summer term projects. The garden was producing its first vegetables. The children were excited to see the results of their work. Margaret suggested a harvest celebration where children could take vegetables home to their families. A lesson in seeing projects through to completion, she said, and sharing the results with the community. Eleanor agreed. They organised a small event, children presenting vegetables to their parents, explaining what they had learned. Villagers came, some still suspicious but curious. They watched German women teaching British children, saw the pride in the children's faces, saw vegetables that would help stretch rations. One mother, Mrs. Davies, approached Margaret afterward. My son says you taught him why plants need sun, she said carefully. He has never been interested in science before. Thank you. Margaret looked surprised. He is a good student, she said. Curious and careful. You should be proud. I am, Mrs. Davies said. Then, after a pause, my husband is still in France, but my son is here learning. That matters. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was acknowledgement. A small crack in the wall of enmity. July arrived with news that German prisoners would begin repatriation. The women at Camp 23 would be among the first groups to leave, transported back to occupied Germany. The final 2 weeks they came to the village. Everyone worked quietly. The garden was thriving. The children had learned to maintain it. Everything was the same, and everything was ending. On their final Thursday, Eleanor organised a small assembly. The children had made cards thanking the German women for their teaching. Simple drawings and careful writing thanking Miss Margaret and Miss Anna and Miss Greta for helping them learn. The women stood in front of the assembly, holding cards made by enemy children, trying not to cry. Emma, the little girl whose knee Margaret had treated, approached with a drawing. I made this for you, she said, handing it to Margaret. So you remember us. The drawing showed a woman in a grey uniform kneeling beside a child, a bandage visible on the child's knee. Above them, Emma had written in careful letters, Miss Margaret helped me. Margaret knelt down to Emma's level, tears running down her face. Thank you, she said. I will keep this forever, and I will remember the brave girl who did not cry. After the assembly, Eleanor walked with the women through the village one last time. Villagers who had glared at them months ago now nodded politely. Some even said goodbye. The transformation was not complete, but it was real. I have something for each of you, Eleanor said when they reached the edge of the village. She distributed small packages wrapped in paper. Inside each was a photograph taken by the village photographer. 6 women standing in the school garden with children around them, the school building in the background, Shropshire countryside beyond. So you remember, Eleanor said. So you can show your families that you survived, that you worked here, that you were treated with dignity, that you taught British children and they learned from you. Margaret held her photograph with trembling hands. In Germany, she said, we were told Britain was our enemy forever, that there could never be understanding between us, that the British were cruel and cold. In Britain, Eleanor replied, we were told Germans were fanatics, that they were all Nazis, that they could not be reasoned with. Yet here we are, Margaret said softly. Yet here we are, Eleanor agreed. Anna, who had been quiet all day, spoke up in careful English. When I return to Hamburg, if Hamburg still exists, I will tell people. Tell them about the English village that was not destroyed, about the teacher who treated us with fairness, about the children who learned from enemies. "Tell them it does not have to be like this," Eleanor said. "Tell them children are children. Tell them teaching is teaching. Tell them humanity survives if we choose to let it." The military lorry arrived at dusk. Lieutenant Mitchell helped them board, her expression respectful now rather than merely professional. The women climbed in one by one. Margaret was last. She paused and looked back at Eleanor. "Thank you," she said, "for showing us that not everything we were told was true, for treating us like teachers, not just prisoners." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. The lorry pulled away down the country lane, Shropshire evening settling over the village. 6 women in grey uniforms disappearing toward an uncertain future. Alice stood beside Eleanor, watching until the vehicle vanished. "You did something important," she said quietly. "I gave them work and treated them fairly," Eleanor replied. "That is all." "You showed them that enemies can teach together," Alice said, "that humanity transcends nationality. That is more than work. That is how we build peace." August 1945. Margaret and the others were processed through holding centres, transported to occupied Germany, saw their homeland for the first time in 3 years. The Germany they returned to was not the Germany they had left. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, families were scattered or dead. Margaret found her sister alive in Dresden, living in a basement with 7 other families. Hamburg, where Anna had taught, was devastated beyond recognition. But they carried with them something unexpected. A memory of an enemy village that was not destroyed, of children who learned from them despite propaganda, of a teacher who had treated them with professional respect. An English village where life continued and enemies could work together. In September, a letter arrived at the school. It had been opened by military censors, stamped with occupation authority seals, forwarded through channels. Eleanor sat at her desk and read it. "Dear Miss Crawford," it began, "I am writing from Dresden. I wanted you to know that I survived the journey home, that I found my sister alive. Germany is destroyed, but we will rebuild. I wanted to thank you for your treatment during our time in your village. I learned more about Britain from you than from any propaganda. I learned that enemies can work together when they remember their shared humanity. The photograph you gave me is precious to me. I keep it with my important papers. Someday, when the world is sane again, I hope to return to Shropshire and see the school garden one more time. Until then, I remember the fairness and the children. And I tell everyone I meet that not all enemies are demons. Some are just people trying to survive. Thank you for teaching me this. Margaret Fisher." Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer with her husband's letters. He had been found alive and was returning home. Her brother's medals, the other thing she considered worth keeping. Years later, historians would note that approximately 400,000 German prisoners worked in Britain during World War II. A small percentage were women, captured serving as nurses and support personnel in North Africa and Italy. They worked in hospitals, schools, farms across the country, their labour filling gaps left by Britons serving overseas. Most of these encounters were unremarkable. Prisoners worked, supervision was maintained, protocols were followed. But in places something else happened. Small acts of humanity that defied propaganda, moments of recognition that transcended enmity. A village in Shropshire where German women taught British children, a school garden planted together, the lesson that humanity survives when we choose to preserve it. Eleanor Crawford continued teaching until 1970, when age and retirement called. The school garden the prisoners had restored was still producing vegetables, maintained by generations of students. The photograph of the German women with the children hung in the school hallway, faded but preserved. Margaret Fisher became a school administrator in Dresden, working on educational reconstruction. She never forgot Shropshire, never forgot the lesson that enemies are made through propaganda and unmade through human contact. In 1967, she wrote a memoir about her war experiences. A chapter was titled "The Village That Should Not Have Existed." Anna returned to Hamburg, resumed teaching when schools reopened. She told her students about the English village where life continued during war, where enemies could teach together, where children learned regardless of politics. Her students grew up knowing their teacher had once been Britain's prisoner, and Britain had treated her with dignity. The incident that had seemed so impossible, German women walking through functioning British streets, teaching British children, seeing propaganda disproven by simple observation, became part of the larger story of World War II's complexity. The story of how propaganda dissolved when confronted with reality, how ideologies crumbled in the face of ordinary life continuing, how a village teacher and German nurses found common ground in education and children's welfare. Camp 23 closed in 1948. The buildings were dismantled, the wire removed, the guard posts torn down. The land returned to agricultural use. But for a period during the war, it had been a place where enemies learned to work together, where hatred was tempered by professional respect, where understanding grew in unlikely soil. December 1978. Eleanor Crawford, now 71 years old, sat in her cottage and talked with a local historian, recording oral histories of the war years. "What do you remember most about the German prisoners?" the historian asked. "The disbelief," Eleanor said. "The day they walked through the village and could not believe what they saw." "Why that moment?" "Because that is when I understood the power of propaganda," Eleanor replied. "They had been taught Britain was destroyed. We had been taught they were monsters. And it took a simple walk through a village to prove both were lies. Truth is found in the ordinary, not the exceptional." "Did it change how you saw the war?" Eleanor was quiet for a long time. "It showed me the war was necessary, but the hatred was artificial," she said finally. "That we could fight without dehumanizing. That victory required defeating armies, not destroying humanity. I wish more people had learned that lesson." The interview concluded. The historian packed up his equipment and drove away. Eleanor sat alone in her cottage, looking at the photograph of 6 German women with British children, at the letters Margaret had sent over the decades after they reconnected in the 1960s, at the drawing Emma had made that Margaret had returned to her years later as a gift. Somewhere in Dresden, an elderly woman named Margaret kept a photograph on her mantel. 6 women in prison uniforms standing with British children in a school garden. Behind them, a village that propaganda said could not exist. Above them, a sky cleared of bombers. Between them and the camera, a distance measured not in miles, but in choices. The choice to treat prisoners with dignity. The choice to value teaching over politics. The choice to show enemies ordinary life when propaganda promised devastation. The war had ended decades ago. The school garden had been replanted countless times. But the lesson remained, growing still in Shropshire soil. That propaganda crumbles when confronted with simple truth. That enemies are made through lies and unmade through honest observation. That humanity survives when we choose to preserve it. One village street at a time. One school lesson. One garden planted together. One child's drawing acknowledging kindness. The hedgerows still divided Shropshire fields. The church bells still rang on Sundays. And the story endured like the best stories do, because it told a truth people needed to hear. That even in the worst of times, ordinary life surviving is a form of resistance. That propaganda fails when confronted with simple reality. That the distance between enemy and teacher is nothing more than the choice to see each other clearly. The village stood largely unchanged. Its buildings older, but its character preserved. But the memory remained, marking the place where 6 German women learned that their enemy's country had not collapsed. Where British villagers learned that German women could teach their children with competence and care. Where a simple walk through functioning streets became a moment of propaganda shattering against reality. And in that small act of allowing enemies to see ordinary British life continuing, Eleanor Crawford and her village demonstrated what historians would spend decades trying to articulate: that the true victory in any war is not just military defeat, but the preservation of truth against propaganda, the maintenance of humanity against hatred, and the recognition that ordinary people on both sides are simply trying to survive with dignity intact.